Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Echo Leadership Podcast. This is a special bonus episode with my friend Rich Birch. And he and I have had some great conversations about leadership, entrepreneurship, and I'm so excited to host you on the podcast today.
Hey, Andy, so glad to be here. Glad to be here. I finally made it. I can tell my mom I've made it to the Echo Leadership Podcast, the very pinnacle of all podcasts. So I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome to host you, man. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about your story. I know that you do host an incredible podcast called the UnSeminary podcast. Prior to that, you were an executive pastor at a fantastic church in New Jersey. You're a consultant. You're an author. You wrote a great book called The Church Growth Flywheel. And I'd love for you just to tell a little bit about your story.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm a local church guy. I love the local church. I'm a bit of a local church wonk. So I'm sure there's people who are listening in who maybe you're into retail and you're you love retail, and you'll sit down and talk with anybody about the square footage of where do you put your, various things in your store. Well, that's me, but for local church. I could literally talk to local church leaders all day long and dive into the details of their operations. And so, yeah, like you said, I've spent most of the last 20 years really in that second seat. In a lot of churches, it's called executive pastor. In 3 different churches, Liquid Church you'd reference. I'm Canadian, don't hold it against me. 2 other Canadian churches. One, this church, Connexus Church, where a mutual friend of ours, Kerry Newhoff, was the lead pastor. He and I continue to be really good friends. In fact, I was just texting with him earlier today. And then before that, at a church called the Meeting House, which all 3 of those, the interesting thing I realized is all 3 of those churches, when I started, we were less than 1,000 and grew to multiple thousands, 3, 4, 5,000 people, and which is very strange in the local church world. Listeners who are listening in will know that just doesn't normally happen. So the vast majority of churches, 94% of all churches, are not growing as quickly as the communities they're in. So that's actually the more encouraging statistic that most people hear is that 85% of churches in the country are plateaued or declined. That's actually a more encouraging way to say that, because actually the vast majority of growing churches aren't growing as quickly as the communities they're in. So, and it's a weird industry to say you want to be a part of. That's a strange, it's like if anybody else is listening in and they're picking places to say, I want to give my life towards, this is not a great industry to give your life towards just on the surface. Obviously, I don't think it's just about that. It's a little bit tongue in cheek, but I love it. I love church leaders. And that has, ultimately grown into what we call UnSeminary, which is a whole bunch of things, a podcast, courses, books, coaching, group cohorts, all kinds of different pieces of the puzzle.
That's fantastic. And one of the things I do love about the label UnSeminary, so I was in seminary for 5 years in Texas. We often say we were in Texas
for those back
5 years too long. And, there are some great things that a seminary does. It certainly helps with your education. If you're teaching the Bible, that's really good. But there are a lot of really practical things that are missing. And I would say that this is probably true for a lot of entrepreneurs and business leaders, that you go to school and most of the stuff you learn on the job while you're doing it, and you get mentors and coaching. I'd love for you to talk about that. What led you to start this UnSeminary podcast? When did you start it, and how long has it been going?
Great question. So the thing that really is at the heart of why we started UnSeminary was, as I would talk with church leaders, particularly of growing churches, the thing I realized was a lot of times on the operations side of what's helping a church grow, those things are not taught in seminary. And in fact, there's a common thing among church leaders when they're kind of either exacerbated or they have a moment of revelation, they'll say, well, they didn't teach me that in seminary. And this past year has been one of those years. None of us were taught how to lead during a pandemic. That just was not in the education. But I think there is, in a lot of seminary educations, there's this idea of once you come out of that professional distinction, you have everything you need to lead. And that's just not true. There are so many things that we need to learn from. And so over the years, I would say the drive of UnSeminary has been particularly to expose people to those ideas and approaches and best practices from growing churches, the stuff that we don't teach in seminary, those things that are, that we're just not taught in school. That has also lent itself a bit more to like cutting edge is not the word I would use with a local church, but it's like best practices, things that are constantly evolving, that are, kind of changing. And there are patterns that you see over time. If you talk to enough leaders from growing churches, you start to realize, oh, like we're doing things similarly, even if we're from a different kind of, stream of Christianity, where, again, back to the retail example, you might be a floor sales, you might run a floor sales store in town. And I'm sure there's you and there's the other guys across town, but at the end of the day, you both are selling floors. And although that's true in the local church, we are at the end of the day pointing people back towards Jesus. There are like these weird silos among various kind of streams of Christianity. And a part of what we tried to do is say, hey, let's try to get beyond some of that and try to turn and talk about what we're learning from each other. So yeah, it really comes back to that core idea of, hey, what are helping churches grow? Originally, it was actually called Killer Church, which was a terrible terrible brand name. Killer Church, the art of execution in the local church. So it had this great double entendre around like killing and execution, which was just not a very life-giving brand. And so we pivoted. We started in 2013, the fall of 2013. I started blogging in 2009, and then it was 2013 was when we committed to doing weekly podcasts. And so we're 500 and some odd episodes in. We just crossed over 1.5 million downloads, and that continues to accelerate. And so, which means there was years of like not very many people listening, and now every week we're somewhere between 5,000 to 7,000 on average weekly listeners to the podcast.
That's incredible. And when you look back on that journey, one of the things that we were talking about earlier is how for you, it's almost been like that Jim Collins 20-mile march. You're putting out helpful content, and talk about how you've thought about growth with content, with blogging, with all the things that you're doing. Like, for example, a lot of us, we hear the stories of people that they put one video out and it goes viral, or they hop on Instagram and they have hundreds of thousands of followers. But for most people, it is a slow and steady growth and putting stuff out there that will help.
Yep.
And you've done that for a good period of time now.
Yes, absolutely. So the kind of joke when people often will come, and I'm sure the same things happens to you, Andy, leaders will come to me and say, hey, I want to start a podcast. And I'll be like, that's great. I really do think it's a great medium. And I'm so pro on it. I'm like, you should do that. And I thought the same thing in 2013 when I started. In 2013, when we started doing weekly podcasts, I thought I was late. I was like, this whole medium has already passed us by. And that obviously is not true. It has just continued to grow and excel. I would have never guessed here in 2021 that this channel would have as much influence as it has now, as many downloads. The joke I often think of is like, my mom now listens to podcasts, and I would have just never thought that would have been, a thing. And so, and there's still a long ways to go. I think there's actually, because really finding podcasts, the shareability, discoverability is an issue on it. They're really hard to find. And so the thing that's great about it is if you can be consistent with your content, I think consistency is a huge deal. You have to own a day of the week, or you've got to own a certain time and stick to it consistently is a big part of this. Now, when I make content, when we think about, and this is whether it's a blog post or a podcast, the thing I'm constantly thinking is this helpful, or am I just trying to build hype? And so you can have the occasional piece, and that has happened to me. I've had the occasional episode, I've had the occasional blog post that goes viral, quote unquote, whatever that means. And, hundreds of thousands, 10x, 100x number of people will see it. But then, the amazing thing that happens is the next day or within 2 or 3 days later, all your traffic goes away. The internet is very fickle. And so I'm not really trying for that. I although it's nice when it happens. I think any content producer that says they're not trying for that is probably lying. But it's nice when it happens, but it isn't the goal. What I'm trying to do, so I'm not trying to build hype content. I'm trying to build helpful content. I'm consistently trying to say, how can I be helpful for my listeners? How do I make things that ultimately, the thing that goes off in my brain is I want people to, like, if they're driving in their car, to pull over to the side of the road and say, oh, I got to write that down. That's an idea. That's something I need to think of, or I need to build this into a checklist, or I want my team to talk about this. This is a good conversation. You and I had a good conversation earlier where we were digging into some real estate questions, and I loved it because it was like, hey, here is some, you've been through a lot on that front from in a local church, and you provided some really helpful insights and did it in a way that's winsome and just trying to help others along the way. And that has really worked over time. That has built an audience. And now, every week, like I say, 5,000 to 7,000 people a week, pretty on average, are watching or listening into the podcast, which I'm always shocked by. Like, I think that's a lot of people. Like, that's, in lots of markets, that's more than you ever need to worry about. That's more than 1,000 raving fans. And about 10,000 of them have given me their email addresses. That's a whole other thing we could talk about, that at the end of the day, I'm not really super interested in like Facebook likes or, Instagram follows. I'm trying to actually get people's email addresses. I'll probably die on that hill. Like, I think that is the best way to build long-term connections with someone, is to keep in their inbox regularly with content that helps them. So that's kind of how I think about that. But on the podcast front, I started and took forever to get to my point.
This is great.
People will say, hey, I want to start a podcast, and I'll be encouraging. I'm like, yes, go for it. But if they ask me the next layer of question, which you did, I'll say, listen, it took me 100 episodes, nearly 2 years of weekly episodes, before I realized what the podcast was about. It took me a long time before I figured out, oh, that's what I'm trying to do. And I don't know whether, and maybe you can do it faster than that. Maybe you can do it in 25 episodes. But what I do know is it's not going to be in your first 5 or 6 episodes. Those are going to be terrible. They're going to be crappy. If I can say that on this podcast, they're not going to be any good. It takes a long time to build up to that. There are some people like Carrie who are like just killer out of the gates. They, but the reason why, if you listen to his story, was for years he did radio, like terrestrial radio in his hometown, interviewing people. So he had tons of experience in this before he then said, hey, I'm going to turn that to the podcasting medium. So it takes a long time. It's not instantaneous. It's not overnight. It takes a long time to build up to it.
It's really good. Yeah, I would resonate with what you're saying. And part of the big mental barrier for a lot of leaders when it comes to content is before you start, you want to figure it all out. But it's as you go, you make changes. And I love what you're saying about consistency. And I think that that's so huge. I'd love for you to unpack. And again, some of this is just my own interest. So if you're a podcast listener and you're part of our tribe and this is not your forte, I would really challenge you that whatever industry you're in, if you can be a content creator in that industry, whether it's a gym that you own or it's a restaurant that you own or you work in tech, that really does add value to the people that you're trying to connect with and reach. So it's a mindset shift that in a lot of ways COVID has fast forwarded for many leaders. I'd love to come back to, Rich, your flywheel. Sure. I know you do blog, you do podcast, you do emails. What's your flywheel for how you've built that out at this point?
Yeah. So weekly we produce, so the Never Fail content is on Thursdays. We release an interview with a church leader. So it never fails. Closely connected to that is on Fridays, we do a summary email that is that summarizes that content from Thursday. Now, close to never fail is on Tuesdays. We release a blog post. Now, I say close to never because I would say in the last 3 years, we've probably released 140 blog posts. So almost weekly. There have been the odd week where we don't release, and frankly, but it's the exception. It's not the rule. We're generally releasing a brand new blog post every week, usually over 2,000 words. And that those Tuesday blog posts are really me trying to develop a training resource for church leaders. So I think about them in that, hey, how do I make something that will be used by my target for them to train their people? So it's like, again, the highest compliment someone can give me is like, I saw your article and we used it in a leadership team meeting for conversation. And so we've experimented, and we've been fairly consistent with doing a Tuesday podcast as well, where we just actually talk through the articles. So it's not new content. It's the same content, just really in audio form. And we've been doing that. So we haven't been doing that as long as the normal podcast, but we've been doing that for maybe 2 years now, 3 years. And it's, so that would be the rhythm, really driving to that Friday email. Now I started the Friday email, the summary email, and so again, that precedes the podcast. So that goes back to 2010 probably. And, I realized, I don't know, like Fridays are not a great day for people to open emails. It is, there's all kinds of evidence that shows that Friday open rates are not great on emails because for whatever reason, people are rushing to the end of the week and all that. But we've stuck with Friday because the first couple thousand people, I committed to them that we were going to send them an email on Friday. And so we've just said like, hey, let's just stick with it. And so we, that's really the flywheel. We keep repeating that week in, week out. We work, we're usually working on the Thursday podcast. We're about a month out. So we're recording 4 or 5 episodes ahead. I have an assistant that works with me on that and just does an incredible job. She works part-time for me, basically a day of the week, making all of that happen. And we really have built the system so that at the end of the day on the Thursday podcast, all I do is the podcast. Like I literally do the recording and then pass it off. And the rest of it is taken care of by our team. So it's not, I'm not touching it after that. And that comes after years of tweaking. Even just today, we were talking about one thing where it's one little small piece of what we do. It's a minor tweak on the Friday email. Then I'm like, hey, let's just change this going forward. Let's do it like that, which actually was stepping me out of, I used to have like kind of like an approval process for this one part of the email, but I'm like, I don't need to do that. Let's just pull me out of that. Frankly, just because it keeps rolling, it keeps doing well. So yeah, is that helpful on the flywheel?
It is, yeah. And what I'm trying to even think through is like, if you were a gym owner or a restaurant owner,
Yep.
how these little pieces, even for small business owners, make a huge difference. So if you said twice a week, I'm going to put out one email that is connected to a blog, one email that is kind of a recap, and I'm going to do a podcast that is good. Pretty easily like just something helpful for your customers. Over time, you're building, it's like you're just investing in them. So when it comes time for them to decide, oh, do I keep going to this gym, or oh, do I keep going to this restaurant, you're helping them. Even like one of the restaurants that my wife and I love is a restaurant called True Food, and we love to eat clean, and they're always like putting stuff out. So this is a recipe, but every once in a while, about once every 10 times, they're like, hey, here's a coupon. And then we'll use that coupon because they've invested. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So on the front end of the week, you're doing a blog post. So you're sending out like an email that you're connecting to a blog post. You're doing a podcast on Thursday. On Friday, you're reflecting. And then how are you connecting and engaging? Like, how intentional have you been on the top of the funnel, engaging new people who would be interested in what you're doing? And what are you doing to do that?
Great question. So this part of what we do, I feel like we can continue to do a better job of. There's lots to learn here on the kind of growing of the list or growing of the top end of the funnel. So on those blog posts, one of the things that we've shifted to in the last year that's been super helpful, and again, this is probably 201, 301 for people that are listening in. Don't get caught up on this. Just get writing. But what we found is every blog post, we now have a call to action at the bottom of those blog posts that drives to more helpful content that then asks them for their email address. Now, the way we're doing this content is every week when we make that blog post, we have a designer. We use a thing called Design Pickle, which we can talk about. It's an outsourced design service. And they turn every article into a PDF. They make it look like a magazine article. Then what we're doing is, now we've been doing that for a long time. We've been doing that for 2 or 3 years. So then what we're doing at the bottom of blog posts is saying, so let's say we're doing a blog post on announcements. We're talking about like the most mundane of church things. How do you talk about announcements? at the bottom of that, we'll say, hey, we've got more resources available on announcements. In fact, we've got 3 PDFs, and we list the names of those PDFs on announcements. Click here, give us your email address, and we'll send you those 3 additional training PDFs. Well, most of those are just blog posts from like 2 years ago, but all we've done is package them up into a PDF to make it look nice. And we use that as content bait. So it's an opportunity for people to give us their email address. That does, over time, we're seeing that consistently growing the list of people who are following. Then I would say 2 or 3 times a year, we do some sort of big push. So church leaders love books. And one of the things about running a blog is people send you books. And so we'll do like for a while, we've done it a couple times now. We'll do like the church leaders book bundle giveaway. And it's like 10 books. Maybe half of them are ones I've bought, and the other half are ones that were sent to me. And we just literally put it out there on social media. We'll do a little small ad spend towards it. We'll email our list and say, hey, we're giving away these books to one person, and that, and in exchange for them subscribing to UnSeminary, and that will drive. Or we'll do, the other thing that's worked well in list building in the last year, we've done a couple summits, or where it's like a 1 day, 2 day kind of online content deal, where we basically talk to a bunch of friends and say, hey, can you help us develop some content for a day? And it'd be like these 10-minute little shots, and we'll package those all up as a single event. It's completely free in exchange for people's email addresses. That helps us with list building as well. Interestingly, I don't know why, I probably should know more of this, but growing the actual listenership of the podcast is a more slow and steady approach. And part of that is the discoverability on iTunes, particularly, and Shopify. It's just not that great. There's not great stumble upon features built into the app. And so it is growing over time, but it doesn't have the spikes that we see on, email, subscribers. We just aren't seeing that. When we started doing the podcast, a part of my theory was, so there's this guy, John Lee Dumas, Entrepreneur on Fire. He's like kind of one of the granddaddies of all podcasts. He does a 7-day-a-week podcast, and he talks to different entrepreneurs every day. And one of the things he said that I heard before we launched was he makes sure that which we do, every guest, they get the kind of social graphics that we make up for them. And we encourage them, hey, when we make it super easy, you're going to get these in, we'll make it easy for you to share with your friends. But the radical minority of guests, like I would say less than 10%, actually share the episode online that we see. We don't see that happen that often. And so originally the idea was like, well, a bunch of these people will share it. But that actually just, for whatever reason, doesn't work out. People aren't as interested in that. You get the odd person that does. Now, probably some of that is because I have an aversion to talking to people who write books. And so if the podcast was just every person was selling their book, then they have something in the game for them to promote the episode, where we're trying to talk to actual practitioners. And so for your average practitioner, there isn't necessarily a huge incentive for them to share the podcast, because it's like they share it on their Facebook feed, and it's like people who go to their church, and they might not actually want that out there with this. People love the sausage. They don't love the sausage factory. So I think that's a part of the reason why that's there, but we'll see. Who knows?
Yeah, it really is fascinating to even the lane that you're focusing on is more of a content marketing lane. And
Yes.
I do think that where a lot of leaders now are giving their attention is social, where they're like, okay, well, I gotta increase my Instagram followers. I gotta increase, the number of likes that I get. But like you said, this is more, you're moving people to connect with a product, to connect with your tribe. What would you say is the place of social in all this?
Great question. So before I get to that, I think if I'm running a gym or a restaurant, like you just said, man, I think a podcast would be a great solution for you. Because you think about this, if you had, like, what's the smallest number you'd get? 15 people a week download this. And let's say it's a 15-minute podcast. Is it worth your time to spend maybe half an hour or 45 minutes to get in the ear of 15 people for that week for 15 minutes? Absolutely it is, from a pure like numbers of just a time investment. If let's say it takes that, you could get the production of a 15-minute podcast down to 45 minutes. Absolutely. You could do that without much work. You could figure that out. So you really only need to get 4 people to listen to that podcast on a weekly basis for it to be worth your time as a leader. Think about that. It only takes 4 people from the actual amount of time engaged. So that, the scale on it, I think, is just great. So, but beyond that, social media. So the way I think about social media, so listen, I'm a huge fan of social. I'm not like an anti-social media guy. I'm not an anti-Facebook guy. I think it's super important. But to me, all that's doing is pointing towards what I hope to get them to, which is either to subscribe to the podcast or to give us their email address. Both of those are the most important thing. Literally, an email address is, well, put it this way. What's the open rate on an email? Most people we're seeing close to 30%. We'll call it 30% open rate. So, if I have 100 emails, 30 of the 100 will open. Most social media posts, if they're not boosted, you're getting maybe 1 to 3%. So that says that an email address is literally 10x the value of a social media post. And I would say it's even more when you look at time spent. So someone who opens their email, they are spending more time, even if they're scrolling quickly through it, they're spending more time than if it just rolls by on Instagram, if it rolls by on the wall on Facebook. So email addresses are worth at least 10 times more. People's actual addresses are worth, what's the open rate on a postcard? It's a lot higher than the open rates on an email or the open rates on some sort of social media post. So I think social is important. I think it is an important spread function. If we can make content that people will ultimately share. So we're trying to make our graphics and the things we do not like an advertisement, not like come and see us, we're amazing, but more like, oh, there's a poignant thought, like, oh, that actually has some value in and of itself. We'll share that, which then we hope has the trickle down impact eventually of someone, subscribing. But yeah, I think I personally don't get obsessed around how many likes did I get this week or what is, because I think the value of those are so much smaller than people's actual email addresses. And I want to make sure we keep our efforts on how do we acquire people's email addresses. And then on the back end, what we're sending to them, the other number we look at consistently is what are our open rates. So we want to grow the list and then keep looking at, are we sending content? If the open rates are going down, what that's saying is, oh, people are not interested in our content. We need to reverse that trend so that we see them, going up over time. And that isn't, to your point, we're not like, those aren't all sales emails. They're really just cultivating that connection. And then, we'll lay it on a couple times a year where we'll get pretty pointed with people and say, here's an online course, or here's a group cohort, or here's a book, that kind of thing. We're earning the right to then come back to them to say, hey, you should buy now, whatever it is that we're selling.
It's so good, man. I love that. I love this conversation. I feel like I could keep going, asking you so many more questions. Part of it is my own desire to continue to grow our Echo leadership tribe. And I do just think for church leaders, for business leaders, there's just so much here. Even a lot of the conversation around how does a church leader think more in the content marketing lane. And so, Rich, anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up our time together here?
Yeah, I'm just a firm believer in consistently staying in front of your audience over time. Stay in the game. You've got to actually love them. I think people, if you don't love your target, which I know some people don't, like you might have a gym and not actually like the gym thing. That's fine. You need to find someone who actually loves that target and get them in front of your people regularly. It might not be you. I know for me, I'm not, there are people that are trying to sell to church leaders, and church leaders can smell that a mile away. They realize, oh, they're just trying to sell me something. They don't actually love me. And so for me, I happen to be one of those people that it gets back to what we said at the beginning. I love talking to church leaders. I could do it all day long. And finding someone with that kind of genuine interest will help your brand grow long-term. Because if people will smell if you're on their side or not, if you're just trying to extract something out of the dialogue.
Incredible. So for people who would love more information or to hear more of the conversations that you're putting out there, where should they go?
Yeah, just go to unseminary.com. It's spelled how it sounds. Yeah, I'd love to have you drop by, check it out. Love to subscribe, reach out, help, let us know if we can help in any way.
Rich, this has been so helpful. Thank you so much for making the time to invest in us and help us get better as leaders.
Cheering for you, Andy. Love what you're doing. Love what Echo Leadership's all about.
It's really fun for me to geek out with guys like Rich. You know, when you get in a conversation like that, there's so many people that have a unique slant on leadership, and that conversation was very helpful for me. I hope you found it helpful. We want to encourage you to go ahead and subscribe and like, share, be a part of this tribe. Our goal as a tribe is to get better as leaders, and we love hearing from you. We love hearing what's working, how is it helping. We want to continue to get better with what we produce as well. So if there's anything that you'd love to hear us share about or speak about, let us know. Go to Echo.Church/leadership podcast. Again, thanks so much for being a part of this community. We look forward to continuing to joining with you at the next episode. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of the Echo Leadership Podcast.